The lobby of the old Grand Chancellor Hotel was a world of its own, a place that never truly slept. It breathed with a constant, rhythmic pulse of life. From the early morning rush of business travelers in sharp suits to the late-night arrivals looking weary from long journeys, the space was always in motion. The sound was the first thing you noticed, a kind of beautiful noise that filled every corner. It was the sharp, happy clinking of ice cubes and glasses from the bar, mixed with the low, confidential murmur of 100 different conversations happening at once. It was the crisp, confident click of high heels on the polished marble floors, and the heavy, rolling thunder of expensive suitcases being dragged toward the elevators. Above it all, the distant, gentle ding of an elevator arriving at its floor acted like a conductor's bell, keeping the whole orchestra in time. Moving through this symphony of orchestrated chaos was a woman who seemed to be a part of the silence, not the noise. She was in her late 70s, though the years had etched themselves onto her face, not just with wrinkles, but with a kind of quiet dignity. Her name was Maria, but to the people who passed through the lobby every day, she didn't have a name. She was just the cleaning lady. She wore the same simple, gray uniform every single day. A shapeless dress that was designed for practicality, not for style. It was the kind of outfit that made you blend in, that helped you become invisible. And Maria was a master of invisibility. Her constant companion was a heavy, rattling cart filled with her tools of the trade. Sprays and cloths, a big mop and a bucket of gray water, and bags for trash. The wheels of the cart had a distinctive, high-pitched squeak that should have been annoying. But it had become such a familiar part of the lobby's soundscape that nobody heard it anymore. It was just background noise, like the hum of the air conditioning or the soft music playing from hidden speakers. Maria pushed her cart with a slow, steady rhythm, her gaze usually fixed on the floor a few feet ahead of her. She was looking for scuff marks, 4 dropped crumbs, 4 little puddles of water that guests tracked in from the rain. She saw the world from a different angle, from down low, where the dirt was. People moved around her without seeing her. A man in a hurry, talking loudly into his phone, swerved at the last second to avoid her cart, his eyes never leaving the screen in front of him. He didn't see the old woman. He just saw an obstacle. A young couple, lost in their own little world of laughter and whispers, would walk right past her, their shoulders almost brushing hers, but they might as well have been on a different planet. Even the staff at the front desk, the polished young men and women with their perfect smiles, would give her a quick, polite nod, but their eyes would slide right past her, focusing on the next guest, the next problem, the next dollar sign. She was a ghost in her own world, a necessary shadow that kept everything clean and orderly, but was never truly a part of the beautiful, busy picture. Tonight felt the same as every other night. The evening rush was beginning to slow down. The dinner crowd from the hotel restaurant was drifting back into the lobby, their faces warm and their voices a little louder than before. Maria was making her final rounds. She had already cleaned the public restrooms, making the sinks shine and the mirrors sparkle until you could see your face clearly in them. She had emptied all the trash cans, replacing the bags with fresh, clean ones. Now she was just doing the little touch-ups, the final details that made her work feel complete. She took a clean, white cloth from her cart and folded it neatly into a square. The cloth smelled faintly of soap and bleach, a smell that was so familiar to her it felt like a second skin. Her first stop was a small, ornate table made of dark, polished wood. It sat between 2 large, comfortable armchairs that were usually occupied. Tonight they were empty. On the table sat a heavy glass ashtray, though smoking hadn't been allowed inside the hotel for years. It was just for decoration, like so many other things in this place. She wiped the table, her movements practiced and economical. Her hand glided over the cool, smooth wood, removing a faint layer of dust and a single, sticky ring where someone had placed a glass without a coaster. She worked with a quiet focus, finding a small sense of satisfaction in making something dirty become clean again as she worked. She allowed her eyes to wander for a moment, to really look at the room she spent so much time in. She saw the high ceiling, painted with intricate gold patterns that caught the light from the giant crystal chandelier hanging in the center. The chandelier threw a million tiny rainbows across the walls and floor, a constant, gentle light show. She saw the dark green velvet curtains that framed the tall windows and the huge potted ferns that stood in the corners. Their leaves so green they almost looked fake, and in the very center of it all, like a king on its throne, sat the grand piano. It was a magnificent thing, all black and glossy. Its lid was propped open, revealing the hammers and strings inside, like the bones of some great beast. The polished wood of its body reflected the chandeliers and the movement of the people in the lobby, turning them into blurry, dancing shapes. It was beautiful, but it was also silent. It was more of a monument than an instrument. It was therefore decoration, to add a touch of class to the hotel's image. Sometimes, a professional pianist would be hired to play on busy weekend nights. But on a regular Tuesday like this, it just sat there, empty, quiet. Maria finished wiping the table and moved her cart to the side. Out of the main path of traffic, she straightened up, placing a hand on the small of her back and stretching gently. A dull ache was always there these days, a constant reminder of her age. She had worked in this hotel for over 40 years. She had started when she was a young woman, a new immigrant with no English and a family to feed. This hotel had fed them. It had put a roof over their heads. It had educated her children. She had seen managers come and go. She had seen the decor change 3 times. She had seen thousands upon thousands of guests walk through these doors. She had seen them at their best, dressed in wedding gowns and tuxedos. And she had seen them at their worst, tired and angry and sad. Through it all, she had remained, a constant, quiet presence. Her eyes drifted back to the piano. She had a special relationship with this piano. It was the one thing in this whole busy hotel that felt like it was on her side. It was a silent listener. When the lobby was empty in the dead of night, and she was the only one there, she would sometimes come and stand beside it. She would run a finger lightly over the keys, not pressing them down, just feeling the cool, smooth ivory beneath her skin. It was a small, secret ritual. Tonight, as she looked at it, something felt different. The usual ache in her back seemed to fade away, replaced by a different kind of feeling, a pull in her chest. The sounds of the lobby, the chatter, the clinking glasses, the rolling suitcases all seemed to melt away into a dull, distant hum. It was as if someone had turned down the volume on the whole world, and all she could hear was the quiet hum of her own thoughts. Her gaze was fixed on the piano bench, the simple leather seat that was currently empty. A flicker of something unreadable, something deep and old, stirred in her eyes. It was a mix of sadness and longing, a memory trying to break through the surface of a long, quiet life. She stood there, perfectly still, a small gray figure in a vast, opulent room, lost in a world that no one else could see. The shift was over. She should have been tired. She should have wanted to go home to her small apartment and a cup of hot tea, but she couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the marble floor. All she could do was stand and stare at the empty piano and wait. The clock on the far wall, a big, golden thing with elegant Roman numerals, seemed to nod at her. Its hands pointed to 9, a clear signal that her working day was done. For most people, this was a moment of relief, a time to pack up and leave the worries of the job behind. But for Maria, the end of her shift often felt like stepping out of one world and into another, much quieter one. The hotel, with all its noise and energy, was her reality. Her small apartment, waiting for her in a nearby neighborhood, was just a place to sleep and get ready to do it all over again. She walked slowly toward the staff area at the back of the lobby, her cart making its final squeaking journey. She punched her time card with a heavy, familiar clunk, the sound marking the official end of her duties. She hung up her gray uniform in her small locker, pulling on a simple cardigan sweater over her blouse. The change of clothes was small, but it felt significant. She was no longer the cleaning lady. She was just Maria, an elderly woman on her way home. But she didn't walk toward the main entrance. Her feet, as if they had a mind of their own, turned her back toward the center of the lobby. She told herself she was just taking a different route, maybe to look at the flowers near the front desk one last time. But it was a lie she was telling herself, a weak excuse for a pull she couldn't explain. The grand piano was still there, sitting under the soft light of the chandelier. It seemed to be waiting for her. The lobby was quieter now, the post-dinner crowd having thinned out. The noise was still there, but it was softer, less demanding. It was the perfect moment. She began to walk, not with the purposeful stride of a worker, but with the hesitant steps of a ghost. She moved along the edge of the room, staying close to the walls, trying to remain unnoticed. A young woman, laughing at something on her phone, walked past her, the sweet scent of her perfume trailing in the air. Maria caught a glimpse of the screen, a blur of bright colors and fast-moving images. It was a world she didn't understand. She passed the bar, where the bartender was busy stacking clean glasses into a pyramid. His movements a precise, practiced dance. He didn't look up. She was just part of the scenery, a shadow moving through the edges of his vision. Her heart was beating a little faster now, a nervous rhythm against her ribs. What was she doing? This was foolish. She should go home, but she kept walking. She passed a pair of large, comfortable armchairs where a young couple sat. They were a perfect picture of modern togetherness, and yet they were completely separate. The man was scrolling through messages on his phone, a small frown on his face. The woman was watching a video with earbuds in, a faint smile playing on her lips as she watched the tiny screen. They were together, but miles apart, lost in their own little digital worlds. They didn't notice Maria as she paused near them, her path to the piano now clear. The empty bench seemed to call to her, a silent invitation, with a deep breath that felt like it came from the very bottom of her soul. A breath that seemed to carry the weight of her 70-plus years. She took the final few steps. She reached the piano and hesitated for just a moment, her hand hovering over the back of the bench. The polished wood was cool to the touch. She could see her own faint, distorted reflection in the glossy black surface of the piano. A small, gray figure looking back at her. Then she lifted her leg, her joints aching a little, sat down. The leather of the bench was smooth and cool, and it sighed softly under her weight. She felt a strange mix of emotions. She felt exposed, sitting here in the middle of everything. For decades, her job had been to blend in, to be invisible. Now, she was in the very center of the room, on display. A few heads turned in her direction. A businessman, waiting for the elevator, glanced over, his expression one of mild curiosity. He saw an old woman in a simple cardigan sitting at the piano. He assumed she was just resting her feet, maybe waiting for someone. He looked away, his attention returning to his phone. The young couple in the armchairs glanced up for a second, their eyes flickering over her before returning to their screens. An old lady resting. Nothing to see here. No one paid her any real mind. She was still invisible. She placed her hands on the keys. They were wrinkled and spotted with age, the knuckles a little swollen from years of work. These were hands that had scrubbed floors and wiped tables, hands that had carried heavy bags of trash, hands that were rough and strong. But they were also hands that had once been guided by another pair of hands, a younger, stronger pair, teaching them where to go. Her fingers, more used to the rough texture of a cleaning cloth than the smooth, cool ivory of piano keys, felt a little clumsy at first. She rested them on the keys, not pressing down, just letting them get used to the feel again. It had been a long, long time. For a full minute, she just sat there, her eyes closed, her hands resting on the keys. The lobby's sounds continued around her, a river of noise flowing past the small, quiet island she had created. She took another deep breath, this one calmer, more centered. She wasn't a performer. She wasn't trying to put on a show. She was just following a feeling, a memory that was so strong it felt like a physical force. Then she pressed a key. A single, clear note cut through the lobby's drone. It was a C note, pure and simple, but it seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with a life of its own. It was a sound that didn't belong with the clinking glasses and the distant elevator dings. It was a different kind of sound entirely. It was a question asked in a quiet room. A few more people looked up this time. The sound was unexpected. It drew their attention away from their conversations and their phones for just a second. Maria didn't stop. She pressed another key, and then another. A simple, hesitant melody began to form. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet and gentle, a little bit sad, a little bit sweet. The notes were not perfect. There was a slight tremor in her touch, a waver that spoke of her age and her long absence from the instrument. But this imperfection was what made it so beautiful. It wasn't a performance. It was a confession. It was the sound of a memory being brought back to life. The melody was simple, but it had a strange pulling quality. It didn't demand attention, yet it commanded it. It was like a quiet voice telling a story in a crowded room, and slowly, one by one, people started to listen. The bartender, who had been polishing a glass with a white cloth, stopped mid-motion. His hand, holding the glass, froze in the air. He tilted his head, his ears trying to place the tune. It was familiar, but he couldn't think from where. The young couple in the armchairs looked up from their phones. The woman slowly pulled out her earbuds, the sound from her video forgotten. The man put his phone down on his lap, his frown replaced by a look of quiet curiosity. Conversations nearby began to falter, speakers trailing off in the middle of their sentences as their ears subconsciously tuned to the sound. The music seemed to have a physical presence, weaving through the room and gently quieting the noise. It was a tune that tugged at a buried collective memory, a feeling that everyone in the room recognized but couldn't quite name. People looked at each other with questioning eyes. A silent, "Do you know this song?" passing between them. The atmosphere in the lobby had shifted from busy and impersonal to something charged, expectant, and deeply moving. And at the center of it all sat a small, old woman, her eyes closed, her fingers dancing lightly on the keys, lost in a world of her own. The simple melody that flowed from the grand piano was like a single thread being pulled from a tangled skein of yarn. At first it was just one note, then another, but soon it began to unravel something much bigger in the heart of the lobby. It was not a famous song you would hear on the radio or a classical piece from a concert hall. It was something else entirely, something that felt both brand new and anciently familiar. The tune was soulful, carrying a deep, quiet sadness that was not depressing, but beautiful, like the memory of a happy tear. It had a gentle, rolling rhythm, like a calm sea at dusk, and a melody that seemed to be searching for something. Reaching out into the busy air and asking a question that no one could quite hear, this music did not shout for attention. It did not crash through the room with loud chords or fast, showy notes. Instead, it commanded attention in the way a whisper in a crowded room can make everyone fall silent to hear it better. It was a quiet invitation, a gentle hand on the shoulder, asking people to just stop for a moment and listen. And one by one, they did. The bartender behind the long polished bar was the first to truly surrender to it. He was a young man with a tired but kind face, used to the constant background noise of his job. He had heard it all, the loud laughter of bachelor parties, the hushed gossip of couples, the angry shouts of business deals gone wrong. He learned to tune it all out, to focus on the clink of ice and the slide of a glass across the wood. But this music was different. He was in the middle of polishing a wine glass, his hands moving in their automatic, practiced way when the melody reached him. It was like a scent he hadn't smelled since childhood. The smell of rain on hot pavement, or his mother's baking on a Sunday afternoon. His hands stopped moving. The glass, half clean and sparkling under the bar lights, remained frozen in his grip. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bar, and just listened. The world behind the bar, with its shelves of colorful bottles and its clattering dishwashers, faded away. There was only the music. It was pulling at something inside him, a feeling he had forgotten he had. Nearby, the young couple in the armchairs felt the pull too. They had been living in their own separate worlds, just inches apart. The young woman was watching a funny video, the small sounds of laughter and music leaking from her earbuds. The young man was scrolling through social media, his thumb flicking upward in an endless, mindless motion. They were together, but alone. But then the music started to weave its way into their little bubbles. For the woman, it was a strange, beautiful sound that seemed to be underneath the audio of her video. For the man, it was a gentle interruption to the digital noise in his head. Almost at the same time, they both looked up. The woman slowly pulled the earbuds from her ears, letting them dangle around her neck. The man placed his phone, screen down, on the arm of the chair. They looked at each other, really looked at each other for the first time that evening. The music was a bridge between their separate islands, connecting them again. They didn't speak. They just shared a look of wonder, a silent question passing between them. What is this song? Where is it coming from? The effect was like a ripple in a pond, spreading outwards from the piano in ever-widening circles. A man in a sharp business suit, who had been striding toward the elevators with a phone pressed to his ear, slowed his steps. His conversation died on his lips. He stopped walking completely, standing awkwardly in the middle of the marble floor, a look of confusion on his face. The music had broken through his busy, important world and forced him to pause. He lowered his phone, his urgent meeting forgotten, and turned his head toward the sound. Two elderly women, who were chatting excitedly about their day of shopping, fell silent. Their heads turned in unison, their expressions softening as the melody washed over them. It was a sound that seemed to speak to their age, to the long lives they had lived. Full of joys and sorrows that this music somehow understood. The music seemed to have a physical presence in the room. It was not just something to hear. It was something you could almost feel. It was like a change in air pressure, a warm current that flowed through the lobby, gently moving past people and touching their skin. It wove itself around the clinking of glasses, turning the sharp random sounds into soft, rhythmic accents. It blended with the low murmur of the few remaining conversations, making them sound like the soft humming voices of a choir. The lobby was no longer just a room with a lot of noise in it. It had become an instrument, and the old woman at the piano was its master. The very quality of the light from the chandelier seemed to change, growing softer and warmer, as if the music was shaping everything it touched, and the most powerful effect of the music was the way it tugged at a buried, collective memory. No one could place the song. It wasn't something they had heard on the radio or in a movie. It was deeper than that. It was like a memory from a dream you can't quite remember when you wake up, a feeling of déjà vu that is strong but has no source. People looked at each other with questioning eyes, a silent, "Do you know this song?" passing between them. A young waiter, carrying a tray of empty glasses, froze in his tracks, his head cocked to one side. He felt like he knew this tune from his childhood, maybe something his grandfather used to hum while he worked in his garden. An old man sitting alone by the window reading a newspaper slowly lowered the paper onto his lap. His face, a roadmap of wrinkles and age, had gone pale. His hand, spotted with age, went to his chest, right over his heart. He didn't know why, but the music made his heart ache with a beautiful, terrible sadness. It felt like coming home to a house that had been torn down long ago. Maria, the source of this strange and wonderful power, was completely unaware of the effect she was having. Her eyes were closed, her wrinkled eyelids shutting out the world. Her body swayed slightly from side to side, a gentle, unconscious movement, like a tree branch in a soft breeze. Her fingers, once stiff and hesitant, were now moving with a grace and passion that seemed to defy her age. They danced across the ivory keys, no longer just pressing notes but telling a story. The melody was growing in complexity and raw emotion. It started soft and sad, but then it swelled, rising up like a great wave filled with a sense of longing and hope. It was the sound of a love that was lost but never forgotten. It was the sound of a goodbye that was also a promise. It was a story told entirely through notes, a story that everyone in the room, in their own way, could understand. The atmosphere in the lobby had completed its transformation. It was no longer a busy, impersonal space where people were just passing through. It had become something charged, expectant, and deeply moving. The air was thick with awe and 100 unasked questions. The noise of the hotel had not just stopped. It had been transformed into a reverent silence. This was not the empty silence of an empty room, but a full, heavy silence packed with emotion and shared experience. Everyone in the lobby was caught in the music's current. They were no longer a collection of individuals, businessmen, tourists, staff, locals. They had become a single audience, a community of strangers, united by a mysterious, beautiful sound. All eyes, whether they knew it or not, were beginning to turn toward the small, gray-haired woman at the grand piano, the quiet, unassuming source of the magic that had frozen them all in time. The music that flowed from the grand piano was no longer just a melody. It was a living, breathing thing. It had started as a simple, hesitant tune, a quiet question asked in a noisy room. But now, as Maria's eyes remained closed, it was growing into something powerful, something that seemed to take up all the space in the vast lobby. Her fingers, which had once seemed stiff and unsure, now moved with a fluid grace that was breathtaking to watch. They danced across the ivory keys, pressing and releasing, coaxing out a sound that was both incredibly complex and deeply simple. It was a sound that felt like it was coming from the very soul of the old hotel itself. The song swelled, rising and falling like a great tide. It was not loud in an aggressive way, but it was immense, filling every corner of the room, pushing against the high ceiling and the tall windows. The notes were rich and full, carrying a weight of emotion that was almost too much to bear. There was a profound sadness in the music, the kind of sadness that comes from losing something you can never get back. But woven into that sadness was a thread of pure, unbreakable love, a love so strong that it refused to be forgotten. Even after all these years, it was the sound of a memory that had been kept alive in the dark, quiet corners of a heart, and was now finally being allowed to see the light. It was a story told without a single word. A story of a beautiful beginning, a tragic middle, and an ending that was both a goodbye and a promise to never forget. The people in the lobby were no longer just listening. They were being pulled into the story. The music was a current, and they were all caught in it, unable and unwilling to swim back to the shore of their normal lives. The young couple in the armchairs had moved closer together. The young man had his arm around the young woman's shoulders, and she was leaning her head against him. They weren't looking at their phones anymore. They were looking at the old woman at the piano, their faces filled with a wonder and a sadness that they didn't understand but felt completely. The bartender had put down his glass and cloth. He was leaning on the bar, his chin in his hand, completely lost in the sound. He felt like the music was telling him a story about his own grandparents, people he had never met, but suddenly missed with a deep, aching feeling. And then it happened. It was a small movement, almost lost in the spell of the music, but it was the spark that would light the whole room on fire. An elderly guest, a man with a face that was a gentle roadmap of a long life, was sitting on a velvet sofa near the piano. His wife was beside him, her hand resting comfortably in his. They had been listening like everyone else, their expressions soft and thoughtful. But as the music reached a new peak of emotional intensity, the man suddenly sat up straight. A look of pure shock crossed his face, his eyes widening and his mouth falling slightly open. It was as if he had just seen a ghost. He turned to his wife, his movements sharp and urgent. He grabbed her arm, his fingers gripping her so tightly that she flinched in surprise. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, terrifying recognition. His wife looked at him, her own expression shifting from confusion to concern. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you all right?" The man opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. He pointed a trembling finger toward the piano, toward the small, gray-haired woman who was the source of the impossible music. He finally found his voice, but it was not a shout. It was a choked, breathless whisper, a sound that was filled with more emotion than a scream could ever hold. "My God," he whispered, his voice trembling so much that it was almost a vibration. "My God, it's the Chancellor's Waltz." The name hung in the air. It was just a few words spoken in a whisper by an old man, but they landed in the silent room like a thunderclap. The Chancellor's Waltz. For most of the people in the lobby, the name meant nothing. It was just a strange, formal-sounding title. But for the few who knew, for the few who had lived in this city for a very long time, the name was a key that unlocked a door to a forgotten past. The man's wife gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide and filled with tears, locked onto her husband's face. She knew, of course. She knew. Everyone of their generation knew the story. It was a local legend, a ghost story that parents told their children. A sad piece of history that had become almost mythical over time. The name began to travel through the room, not as a sound, but as a wave of understanding. The hotel manager, a sharp, middle-aged man who had been walking across the marble floor, froze mid-stride. He had heard the old man's whisper. He knew the history of his hotel, of course. He knew all about the tragic fire that had swept through the building in 1947. A fire that had claimed the lives of several guests and one of the hotel's most beloved employees, the pianist. And he knew the story of the song, a beautiful piece of music that the pianist had composed for the hotel's owner. A piece that he had played only once at a memorial service for the victims. Before the sheet music was lost in the chaos and the fire, it was a song that was supposed to be gone forever, a ghost of a song. In that instant of shared recognition, time stopped. It was a strange collective phenomenon, a physical freezing that affected every single person in the lobby. The bartender, who had been reaching for a bottle, stopped with his hand in the air. The young couple, who had been leaning into each other, froze in their embrace. The businessman, who had been standing awkwardly in the middle of the floor, became a statue. Everyone froze. They weren't just pausing to listen anymore. They were witnessing something impossible. They were in the presence of a miracle. The lobby, which had been a symphony of sound and motion just minutes ago, was now as still and silent as a photograph. The only movement was the slight sway of Maria's body and the dance of her fingers on the keys. The only sound was the haunting, beautiful music that filled the air with the presence of a ghost. All eyes were locked on the old woman at the piano. She was no longer just an old lady resting her feet. She was an impossible conduit to a forgotten past. She was a bridge across a chasm of 70 years. She was a ghost from 1947, sitting at a piano and playing a song that should have been silent forever. The perception of her had changed in an instant. Her simple cardigan and her wrinkled, worn hands were no longer just signs of an old working-class woman. They were now imbued with a profound, almost sacred significance. She was a keeper of secrets, a vessel of memory. The music she was playing was not just a song. It was an echo from a tragedy, a message from a lost soul. The people in the lobby were not just an audience anymore. They were witnesses. They were witnessing a moment that defied logic. A moment where the past had reached out and touched the present with a cold, beautiful hand. And in the face of such a miracle, all they could do was stand perfectly still, hold their breath, listen to the sound of a ghost playing the piano. The final haunting chord faded into a silence, so absolute it was louder than the music that had preceded it. It was not a sudden stop, but a slow, gentle release, like a long, deep breath being let out after a moment of great pain. The note hung in the air for a second, shimmering with all the emotion it had carried, and then it was gone. And in its place, there was nothing. The lobby of the Grand Chancellor Hotel, a place that had been a symphony of sound for decades, was now completely, utterly silent. No one moved, no one spoke, and no one clapped. Clapping would have felt like a violation, like throwing a rock into a perfectly still, sacred pool of water. It would have broken the spell, and no one wanted the spell to end. The air was thick with something that felt like a mix of awe, sorrow, and a profound, unspoken understanding. It was a full, heavy silence, packed with the weight of a 70-year-old story that had just been told for the first time in a generation. Maria was the first to move. But it was a slow, uncertain movement. Her fingers, which had been dancing with a life of their own, stilled on the keys. The music that had been flowing through her, using her as its vessel, was gone. The spell was broken for her. Her eyelids, which had been shut so tightly, fluttered and then slowly opened. For a moment, her eyes were unfocused, still lost in the world of memory and music. Then they began to focus on the world in front of her, and what she saw made her freeze all over again. She was no longer in a quiet, empty lobby. She was in the center of a silent, staring crowd. A sea of faces was turned toward her, all of them fixed on her with an intensity she had never experienced before. There was the bartender, his mouth slightly agape. There was the young couple, their eyes wide and wet with unshed tears. There was the hotel manager, standing frozen in the middle of the floor. And there were dozens of others, guests and staff alike, all looking at her with the same expression of shocked reverence. A wave of confusion and then panic washed over her. What had she done? Why were they all looking at her like that? In her mind, she had just been sitting at a piano, lost in a memory. She had forgotten where she was, forgotten who she was. For a few precious minutes, she had been a young girl again, sitting on her father's lap, his hands guiding hers over the keys. But now, she was back. She was a 70-something-year-old cleaning lady, and she had just made a scene in the middle of the hotel lobby. The powerful musician who had been channeling ghosts seemed to shrink and vanish, placed by the quiet, unassuming woman who was terrified of being the center of attention. She felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the piano bench and become part of the furniture, the way she always had. With a small, almost apologetic movement, she began to pull her hands away from the keys. As she did, the spell in the room seemed to break for everyone else. A collective, soft breath was released, a sound like a sigh passing through the whole crowd. The manager, a sharp-looking man in a well-fitted suit, finally found his feet. He had been standing there, his mind racing, trying to process the impossible thing he had just witnessed. He knew the history of the hotel better than anyone. He knew the story of the fire and the story of the pianist who had died. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the song he had just heard was the Lost Chancellor's Waltz. He had to know. He had to understand. He began to walk toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. As he moved, the crowd seemed to part for him, creating a clear path from the edge of the room to the piano. No one spoke. They just watched him, their eyes moving from the manager to the old woman on the bench and back again. The air was still thick with tension and anticipation. The manager felt the weight of all their eyes on him. He wasn't just the hotel manager anymore. He was a representative of everyone in the room, asking the question that was burning in all their minds. He reached the piano and stood beside her, feeling a strange need to be respectful, to not get too close. He looked down at her small, hunched figure, at her wrinkled hands resting in her lap. He cleared his throat, but his voice still came out as a soft, reverent whisper. "Ma'am," he said, his voice full of a gentle awe. That was beautiful. Paused, searching for the right words. Words that wouldn't sound foolish or demanding. How? How did you know that song? Maria looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She saw the kindness in his face, the genuine curiosity and respect in his eyes. She saw the faces of the crowd behind him, all waiting for her answer. She knew she couldn't just get up and walk away. She owed them an explanation, or at least she owed them the truth. She took a deep, shaky breath, and when she spoke, her voice was raspy with emotion, quiet but clear in the silent room. "My father wrote it," she said softly. The words landed in the silent room with the gentle weight of a falling feather. A few soft gasps came from the crowd. The manager's eyes widened in disbelief. It was an answer that was both simple and impossible, an answer that opened the door to an even deeper mystery. Maria saw the question in his eyes and continued, her voice a little stronger now. Filled with the love and pride she had carried for her father all these years. "He taught it to me," she said, her gaze drifting from the manager's face to the empty space on the bench beside her, as if she could still see him sitting there. He would sit here for hours, playing for the guests. He wrote this for the hotel's anniversary. He was so proud of it. She paused, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. He was sitting right here when the fire started, and there it was. The final piece of the puzzle. The truth that no one had expected. A truth that was more heartbreaking and more beautiful than any ghost story. The song wasn't just a memory of a tragedy. It was a legacy. It was a father's last gift to his daughter, a piece of his soul that she had carried with her in silence for over 70 years. The old woman at the piano wasn't a ghost. She was a daughter, keeping her father's memory alive in the only way she could. The emotional weight of her words crashed down on the room. The young woman in the armchair openly wept, her head buried in her partner's shoulder. The old man who had first recognized the song bowed his head, his own tears falling freely. Maria didn't wait for more questions. She had said what she needed to say. The story was told. With a quiet dignity that was breathtaking, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the manager. Then she stood up from the bench, her body aching from the stillness. She turned and began to walk away, not with the hurried steps of an embarrassed woman, but with the slow, steady pace of someone who had completed a long and difficult journey. She walked through the silent crowd, and this time, they didn't just see a cleaning lady. They saw a hero, a keeper of secrets, a living link to a forgotten past. They parted for her, their faces filled with a deep, profound respect. She walked away from the piano and disappeared back into the quiet corridors of the hotel, leaving behind a lobby full of people who would never forget the moment the past came alive. The grand piano sat empty once more, but it was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a memorial. Its silence was now filled with the echo of a father's love and a daughter's beautiful, heartbreaking tribute.